Oh, you are indeed there, my skylark. All the melody on earth is contained in my Jane's tongue to my ear. All the sunshine I can feel is in her presence.
Sacrifice? What do I sacrifice? Famine for food? Expectation for content? To be privileged to put my arms around what I value, to press my lips to what I love, to repose on what I trust. Is that to make a sacrifice? If so, then certainly I delight in sacrifice. Lillian, it's a very special and somewhat bittersweet day on our podcast. How are you?
I'm doing good. I've got no bitter. All sweet here, girl.
Oh, well, I only say that because we finished the novel, so now we don't have any more original Jane Eyre to read, which is a little sad because it's been really fun going through this book.
Yeah, hot take, and I know this is going to shock everyone listening to our Jane Eyre podcast. I liked Jane Eyre.
I like Jane Eyre too. I think we should put a little sticker or a little quote that says about this podcast, like, surprisingly, I liked Jane Eyre. Reader, I liked it. In
a strange turn of events, Jane Eyre, good book.
Yeah, would recommend.
5 out of 5 stars. You did it.
Surprisingly, I know, right?
But we're the first ones to decide Jane Eyre. Good book.
Oh my gosh. So we are now officially members of the real Jane Eyre fans. So far we've been pretenders. Now we are no longer that. We are real. We are legitimate. And I'm so excited to talk about the end of this great story.
I am as well. And for those of you who are maybe decided that the first episode of our podcast that you want to listen to is our last section on the book. First of all, good job picking. You did a great job. Your decision-making skills, 10 out of 10. But usually we do a little speed run of Jane Eyre, but we don't normally do those with our book episodes because is book.
Well, we're just going to end up repeating ourselves when we chat about it in depth anyway. So,
but what I would like to do before we start this is very similar to our usual speed runs, but it's a little bit different. What Piper is looking at now is my book, my copy of the book I've annotated. And I have little pink Post-its at the very top of my book. And these are notes that I started writing just for me. And they're marking different sections that tend to be beats in movies and things like that so that I could keep track of where those were to be able to refer back to my notes in the book for future episodes of this podcast. I think it might be my finest speed run of Jane Eyre, and I'm hoping I could do a little performance and read these for the podcast.
I'm very excited. So just to review, you are now about to give us how Lillian Cotter breaks up the sections of the book. Essentially. Okay.
The names she wrote for her. And I think most people will be able to follow most of these, but some of them are not going to make sense, listeners.
Well, it's just going to be up to the really astute people who have either listened to this podcast long enough that they know you in the way that you think, or who know the story well enough to be like, oh yeah, top hat, that I know what scene that is. Go for it.
So to give you a flavor, the first one is Red Room. Because that's the first one I wrote. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But what I would love for you to do, Piper, is time me while I, like we do with our normal speed runs.
Will do.
While I read these Post-its.
Gladly. Let me just pull up my handy dandy stopwatch here. Alrighty. I'm ready when you are.
Red Room. Fuck Aunt Jane. Liar. Meet Pilot. Pilot by the fire. Speak. Fire. Start, stair slippers, drag, then we've got yelling, then we go into pay me, before it's liar dies, and then it is Jane comes home, then Ireland, family's day out, gaslighting 101, wife, not angry, disappointed. Jane is not like other girls. Jane's great plan. When St. John was there. There we go. Rich.
The end?
The end.
1 minute 27 seconds. There was a lot of just pausing to read, but I loved it.
Piper's gonna cut out some of my pausing. I just want you guys to know that her experience was a slow run.
I think what struck me most about your captions is that for the proposal scene, you titled it Ireland. I'm like, dude, that's like true love, kissing, emoting. But you say the Ireland part, but all right, whatever floats your boat.
Here's the thing. I never not one time mentioned Rochester's name. These are things that occurred to me while I was rereading these, thinking about whether or not I should do this. I never not one time mentioned Rochester's name. I also referred to Jane as a liar and then later say that a liar dies, but it was Aunt Reed who died.
Yep.
And I mentioned Pilot's name 3 times.
Yes, I could see that dogs are priority for you, Lillian.
Because honestly, like, and I think we've read this in this chunk of the book that we're going to go through today. Pilot's always been the first person that gets recognized. First, she meets Pilot when they're on the road.
Yep.
When she gets back to the house, she immediately recognizes Pilot.
Yep.
When she goes to see Rochester again, who greets her first? Pilot.
Yes. Although she does see Rochester go outside to feel for the rain.
Yes, but Rochester doesn't even notice that his fairy elf is outside.
Dumb blind fool.
You dumb. Oh my gosh. I am so excited about this chunk.
Yes.
I hated
God.
St. John.
Dude.
I loved every beat of this chunk, though.
Before we got to this part, I was like, okay, St. John's annoying and whatever, but he's not the worst. But then we got to this part, and I don't know if you follow us on Instagram. I was texting Lillian about this, and she shared it on her stories. My reaction of like everything that he was saying. And I think what infuriated me so much about it is I swear to God, I knew assholes like this when I was in college. Like very pretentious, always men, just being like, oh, like, I'm not really having a conversation with you. I'm just kind of talking at you and I know what's going on. And even when people disagree, I either don't listen or I bulldoze over them or I persist or I whine. And it's just like so fucking full of themselves. And so that like made me want to peel my face off because I know that those people are out there and I hate that other human beings have to interact with them. So that made that hard for me.
That's what I mean by like, I hated St. John. I loved this section is like something that is held true from the very first section we read through to the end here is that Bronte writes real characters.
Yeah.
Like the characters that are on screen on page for 5 seconds feel like full people to me. St. John is someone you know. Like you know a St. John in your life, and I'm so sorry that happened to you. Hopefully, it's not someone you're related to.
Hopefully,
but
hopefully it's not someone you work with. In which case, even with family, so you can sometimes draw barriers. But if you work with someone, you're like, well, I have to keep my job, so I have to see this person every day. If that's you, I'm so sorry. We're gonna send you a Airbuds fuzzy blanket in the mail.
We don't have them. We're going to cross stitch one by hand for you.
Yes, because you deserve it.
Interestingly enough, and I think we'll talk more in depth about why St. John sucks so hard in this book section in particular. But last time we also got little glimpses of St. John. And sometimes, you know, I do social media. I do post every single day. You got to think of an idea. So I posted thinking this was going to be our least controversial take ever. It's wrong to hate people, but St. John Rivers is a fictional character, so it's okay to hate him. And we got like 20 comments on that post.
Of people, not them defending St. John.
People defending St. John.
Weird. I need to go back and read that.
So I have the post up now. And it's not all of them are defending St. John. Sometimes some of them are being like, yeah, St. John's the worst. But here's some of the best takes from our Instagram comment section. One is from somebody named Amanda who said, guys who are like St. John when they're young end up like Brocklehurst when they get older.
Accurate. Very accurate.
Great take there.
Yes.
A raccoon who's one of my favorite of our followers said, I don't hate him. He made his choices and Jane made her choices. They actually have a lot in common. We'll talk about that.
We will talk about that. I was like, I've got things to say on that, but I think I need to go into my own personal analysis before I say why.
I just want to bring up some of our listeners' thoughts, and then when we go into our thoughts, we'll probably reference back to these. Dana, who's been a fan since day one, said he is challenging.
Dana, you are a saint.
There's a listener who commented, and I want you to know that if there's anything that we say about you, it's with love and respect for who you are as a person. But Jackson said, wow, I'm genuinely surprised. I'm the complete opposite. I adore St. John and despise Rochester. Ooh. I do think that St. John needs to work so that I'm not being in control. And I hate him for being directly involved in colonization, which true. Good. But I don't necessarily support Jane being with him, but I find St. John hilarious. And then I said, genuinely, I want to know, what do you like about St. John? Mm-hmm. So he responded lovely with, I love the trope of an uptight guy who's in love with somebody but won't admit it. And I think that there's a lot of St. John developing feelings with Jane that is really interesting to me.
Very cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. I don't want to poo-poo anyone's thoughts. So if that's how you feel, awesome. Cool.
Yeah. You're glad. Just wrong.
No, Lillian, shut up. This is an accepting podcast. That was the most Sam thing you've ever said. Where one of his things always is like, oh yeah, you're entitled to your opinion. It's wrong, but you're entitled to it. And I'm like, I am going to put knives in your food. Like, you be nice. Oh my gosh. No. Sir, whoever shared that comment with us on our Instagram, thank you. Your opinion is totally valid. Lillian and I will probably disagree as we elaborate on our feelings later on. But I mean, yeah, every character, like you said, this is a well-written, real character. There are definitely like pluses to his minuses. So,
well, yeah, absolutely. And I think what I got from what Jackson was saying, which I do think is correct, is I think a lot of what he's saying is that he likes the character of St. John. Yeah. But not necessarily the person that St. John would be in the world, which is almost like the role that he's filling in the story. Yeah. And that's what some of the other comments were commenting on as well, is that they think that St. John is an important part of the story of Jane Eyre.
Oh, 100%.
That I agree with.
Yes. And I think I can relate to that in saying, like, I have always been drawn to villains and bad guys, mostly because I find them extremely charismatic. And I can sometimes, if I'm in the wrong group of people, like casually mention that, and someone's like, this is a really bad person. I'm like, oh, I'm not justifying their actions. That is a very bad fictional character, and the things that they did on the page were wrong. But also his charisma, am I right though?
Well, and it's so interesting that you bring that up, because in so many ways, I think St. John is a really interesting commentary on the idea that on paper, he's who Jane should be with.
Right.
Right? Mm-hmm. And I think on paper, we shouldn't like Rochester.
Exactly.
But as we talked about a lot last time, we do.
Yes.
And why do we? And I think it's similar to what I hear a lot of people saying about why they like villains. And I think I've mentioned this to you before, but there's this thing, I saw it on TikTok. It could have originated elsewhere. So I apologize to whoever's idea this was. It's on the internet now. There's no taking it back. It belongs to us all. It's the hero. The reason people are attracted to the villain and not the hero is that the hero will give up his love to save the world, and the villain will burn the world to save his love.
Stops my heart every single time. In fact, there's a line later about Rochester in this chunk that I'm going to talk about with that. But yes. I think we've done a lot of good kind of like up in the air talk. I want to kind of focus on kind of going through these last few sections of our beloved story. One of my first notes that I have, and we've kind of already touched on this a little bit, is the level of British patriotism in these last like few pages felt a bit much to me. And I don't know. I think it's mainly because I'm associating it with how much they're talking about like going to India, and it kind of feels like they're saying they're going to fix India, and it feels very imperialistic. And there's so many things when like Jane is talking about how she's so happy being the school teacher, and she's like, oh, but even the lowest peasantry, they were British peasantry, so therefore they were the best in the whole wide world. And I'm like, Jane, calm down, okay, baby? Like, I'm glad that you love your country. I also too. God bless America. But also, like, this is a bit much. So that distracted me.
Listen, you know me. I am mostly against the things that America stands for. Like, I'm pro-freedom. But, like, you want to talk about criticizing your own government, I can criticize America. But you want me to feel patriotic? Start talking about how great Britain is.
Yes. And I'm like, listen, we left for a reason.
Let me tell you about some tea one time.
We love all of our British listeners, by the way. Please, if we ever come over to the UK, have us over.
Listen, we're planning trips.
We need couches to sleep on.
This was all a joke. We'd like visas, please and thank you.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Okay. So that was my first big note. That she and St. John were both just having a time talking about how England is the greatest thing in the whole wide world. So
I think one of the things that just is so pissed me off with that whole idea is like, St. John is the worst and his takes on religion are bad. Like, that's Jane's whole point. That's Bronte's whole point. But Bronte is still pro him going to India and still talks about that like it's a good thing. Ugh.
And that is totally a product of the time. I think it is very important when reading historical literature to try and put yourself in the mindset of the people at the time. And it's easy now with the information and exposure that we have to have more liberal, diverse viewpoints. And so I can't necessarily blame an author in that way, but it does, just from a modern standpoint. I was reading it and I'm like, that part did not age super well.
And I think in some ways, I also feel like Bronte was probably softening her views to come off as very pro-British because otherwise you can't sell that book, right? Like, she's publishing this book in a time and place. She has an audience who has views. She can't criticize religion as intensely as she does and not throw in some. But obviously, Britain colonization, great. God number one. Big fan of God. I just think trees, you know?
So I want to kind of touch there on the comment you just made about, criticizing religion, because we really need to find a theologist to have on this podcast with us to like talk in depth about this, because that was the other thing that really stood out to me from these last few chapters is how much she focuses on these ideas of both faith, spirituality, religion, and how people kind of use that in different ways and connect with that in different ways. Because I do think there is definitely a level of Bronte kind of criticizing the way that St. John uses his faith, which I think you and I both agree is toxic. It's manipulative and not great. But then there's so much that she spends time talking about, like the way that Jane is genuinely moved when he's like reading scripture and the way that she personally connects to that. And we even see when she goes back to Rochester, him having a bit more of a like, while you were gone, I sort of turned to my own faith moment. And so we know, at least I know this, I think you know this too, that she was the daughter of a, what's the term? Her dad was
minister or whatever.
Yeah. He was like a religious person. And so
I only know Catholic terms. I was raised Catholic and I know he wasn't a priest. So.
Yeah. I don't know if he was like I think he had a parsonage. I don't know. We don't know these words. This is why we need a theologist.
Yes, we're going to get an expert on. We literally have never claimed to know anything.
So I think like she grew up in a religious household and clearly this is a big part of her life. And it was interesting to me how much she kind of turned back to this and kind of focused on it at the end of this book.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think there are a lot of other themes that she drives home hard in these last few chapters. Another one that I want to loop back to is feminism, because I saw a lot of those themes come up and really highlighting the point she's making there, which I think is very, very interesting. But I completely agree. And I think so I have heard, and I frankly have no idea where, because I do a lot of time researching Jane Eyre, but I have heard somewhere that Charlotte, in writing St. John, was capturing her like brothers and her father. Like these are reflective. That's part of the reason why they feel so real, is that they are representative of real people. And that's part of the reason why I think it's easier to see on a reread when you're not jarred by how horrendous this man is, the kinder way that she's trying to depict him.
Yeah.
It is very clear that he's supposed to be a good person. That I genuinely think Sinjin is supposed to be a good person who she doesn't agree with and she doesn't get along with. It's that idea that she's had all along, which is he is a representation of the structure of religion and structured religion, and somebody who has the answers and is going to go out and force other people to live within this list of rules, not because they feel that it's the right thing, but because that's what God told them to do. And they're doing it to earn points to eventually to suffer here on earth enough, the inherent value of suffering to be able to have the joy of the afterlife. And Bronte is explicitly saying that's probably not the best idea. And there's so many things and people and joys and good that you miss by focusing on that.
Yeah.
And that the way to connect with religion is more grounded than that.
Where I totally agree. I think it's interesting though, and again, this is where we get the true depth of her characters and her writing and her realness, because in real life there is no simple like black and white. No one person is like, well, I'm just this and that's all. And so I think it's so interesting that when Sinjin proposes to her and they're doing that back and forth for a while, Jane, upon reflection, says to herself, she's like, I think this is great work and I really admire that you're going out and doing it. And she's like, I think I could go out and be a missionary. I think that's something I could do well. Like, she's not necessarily opposed to that. It's just more so then with her like kind of hindrance is like, well, you don't love me. Your proposal sucked. It hurts my feelings. And I'm not going to go as your wife. So stop asking. But then like the fact that there's so many moments in this when she's describing how Jane like feels towards Sinjin. Oh yes. Okay. So there's this whole chunk when Sinjin is learning Hindu Sandhi and then forces Jane to do it as well. It's in those chapters or those sections where Jane is describing herself as very submissive to him. And I think it's this idea where, to start, she really admires this person. She's talked about that a lot, even when away from him. She admires his intellect. I think she admires his like dedication to his faith, although the way he acts on it is questionable. And she finds like great inspiration from him. And so this like her becoming submissive under his tutelage because she admires this person so much, it made me first really sad because I'm like, Jane, that's not you. You are the strong, outspoken person. You should not be made submissive by anybody. But I think the reason she does kind of like bow to that is this like longing for kindred that she's finally found in this person. She doesn't want to lose that. So even after she refuses him to like marry him, and then she comes back still, and she's kind of like, I don't know, it seemed to me like almost like licking his wounds to be like, please still be my cousin and brother, and it's gonna be great, and I still admire you. And she still gets swept up when he reads that scripture, and it's almost enough that it convinces her to like where she's like, oh, maybe I will marry this guy and it will turn out good. But then thank God she hears Rochester's voice.
Well, and I think all of those points are so incredible. Like I love that idea of like seeing the duality in Jane of this strength, and yet when she recognizes what she sees as the right thing, going, okay, well, I agree with him in principle, so why wouldn't, maybe he is right? Which I think that's, I don't want to go too far into this because we're not experts on this, and there's real possibility of doing damage with what I'm about to say by not being an expert. But it's how abusers behave, right? Like it's gaslighting her in a way that abusers behave, where they make it seem like their conclusion that they've come to is the right conclusion. And then they trick you with this logic that is based off of like half-truths. And I think what Sinjin's point that I think Jane believes that it's the right thing to dedicate your life to God. And I think Sinjin takes that and sees that. And that's the thing that they both have in common, that you should dedicate your life to God. The difference is Sinjin believes himself to be a representative of God,
Mm-hmm.
and in many ways has deified himself, which I think is the criticism that Bronte is bringing about the structure of the church, is that the leaders in this religious organization deify themselves and believe that they understand exactly what God is and wants and thinks and you should do.
Mm-hmm.
And St. John takes that and says, this is not a question, this is the answer, in spaces where I think someone like Jane goes, no, it's about the question.
Yeah.
Like,
no, totally.
And so somebody approaching a person who's more open-minded and more flexible with that, with this certainty that St. John approaches it with and says, this is what things should be, and this is what good is. And somebody who wants to be good and doesn't have a solid answer to that because it's an unanswerable question
Mm-hmm.
can get sucked into this other, more just like confident, just louder person.
Yeah.
Telling them what they should do.
No, Lillian, I'm so glad you said that, because when I was reading that section and I was taking my notes, I definitely had stuff written down here about how manipulative I think St. John is after like she refuses his proposal, and even before then.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad that you talked about it, because I wanted to hear kind of your take and your thoughts on that. But I think he's not a dummy. He sees how much Jane, admires him and is like desperate for this kinship. And so I think one thing that like made my skin crawl is the way that he acts after he leaves, after the proposal fails, when at first he's like, I'm going to go off to Cambridge. And then the next chapter is like, but he didn't go to Cambridge. He stayed for 2 weeks, and he was weird and quiet and stoic to me. Like just literally giving the silent treatment. He's just hovering around, making her feel bad while still pulling on this like greater than thou kind of like aura of like, he's like, oh, little lamb, like you'll turn around. I'm going to lead you into the right choice, which is letting me fang you. And it's just like without any love. And I'm just like, oh God, it made me so upset. And yes.
And it's like, because he's so like, we haven't talked about sex much in this. The Hot and Bothered podcast talks about it a lot. And this is a very sex-heavy section, very subtextually.
Yes.
And we could do a whole episode on that, and maybe we will. But he, like, absolutely, the moments when, like, he implies that it would be improper for Jane to do this, and she goes, why? You're basically my brother. And he's like, no.
He's like, but we're gonna be doing the deed, so.
We're gonna, listen, God said I can fuck you if you marry me.
He literally has a line where he says, like, when they're doing their back and forth, and he's like, no, I wish to mate. That is the word that he uses. And I wanted to chuck my book out the window. I was like, God, you're so icky. I'm like, even though Rochester is a rake and he is a attempted bigamist, he is more of a gentleman when it comes to that.
Well, and like, I also feel like Rochester has a clear, even though Rochester's more explicit about his sexual desire for her, he also has a clearer understanding of consent.
Yes.
And only wants Jane if Jane wants him.
Yes.
Where St. John wants Jane if God says it's okay.
Yes.
And he's God, so he gets to decide that it's okay. He believes he is entitled to her body, her mind, and her spirit, and he's going to, quote, set her task by the hour. Sorry, guys. Piper and I just spent 10 minutes puking because that was so gross.
God, he's awful. Yeah. No, I hated all of that. Also, his whole proposal was like cringy as fuck. He's like, take a walk with me, Jane, out of nowhere. After, oh my God. Also, I had a theory at one point when Jane starts kind of like crying while studying with him because she's thinking about Rochester and how much she misses him. And he sits and stares at her and doesn't comfort her. And I'm like, this guy's a sociopath. He doesn't actually feel emotion. He just like knows how to mimic it to manipulate other people. That gave me the EBGBs. To then have to go on a creepy walk with this guy where he like they don't say anything to one another until he suddenly, like, I hate that they use this word so often, ejaculates. That's how they say that he said loudly that he's like I've decided I'm going and I know what's right and blah 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 blah. He makes some big statement, and then it says in the book that he doesn't speak to her for 30 minutes before he then decides to be all like, I'm gonna propose to you. You need time to think. I'm gonna go lay in the grass while you decide to
and he comes back mad at her that she needed a minute.
Oh my God.
We need to find, in addition to a theologist, we need to find a therapist who studies narcissists, because this man is a narcissist.
Oh, yes.
I think another place that we're going to just beat St. John into the ground is the feminist themes in this. And again, there's something that I don't do in many sections. Is getting bored and deciding to look deeper instead of just being like, move on. But something caught me when I was reading this section. It's right at the beginning of the chunks that we read today, which I don't know that we mentioned. We're reading chapters 34 through the end. So right at the beginning of chapter 34, Jane is talking about going home to Morehouse and getting it ready for Mary and Diana to come home. And St. John makes fun of her for taking a couple of days off before they're home to get the house ready. She goes into a great deal of detail about all the work that she and Hannah put in. They clean the house. They leave the heart of the home with the furniture that she knows the girls would love, but freshens it up with new carpet and new drapes. And where can she put money to make the house feel more comfortable and cozy without losing that familiarity that it has? And she does it with a great deal of care and a great deal of empathy. And it's beautiful.
And she's so excited about it. There's a lot of joy.
Yeah. And it's also deeply feminine. That is what women were supposed to do. And St. John belittles it immediately and thinks that this is a waste of her time. She talks about how much joy it brings her to do this. And St. John belittles every piece of what she did. And his claim is because it's not God's work. But the reality is, the work that he is trying to get Jane to do is men's work. And Jane is a woman. And so she is actively doing women's work. And St. John believes that she is above it because it's women's work. It's very similar to what we talked about in the Miss that the 94 radio adaptation had, where it had this really particular brand of feminism that women needed access to the power structures that men have, as opposed to just valuing, I think women deserve access to that, but there's also a feminism that's valuing the work that is considered feminine.
Yeah.
And I think that is reading this with that lens on, it is an incredibly feminist take.
Yeah.
The idea that the way that Bronte describes this work that she's doing, it inherently has a huge amount of value. And St. John can go fuck himself.
He really can. I honestly think, though, he would do that about anything, because you're right, he is a narcissist. If it's not his way, he could walk across people who are laboring in a field, and he'll be like, these simple peasants, their time would be so better spent if they were just reading their Bibles and converting people to Christianity like I'm gonna go do. And it's just dude, stop jacking yourself off. Other things are good.
But I do think that if he saw people laboring in a field, he would be able to find a way to make that, even Jane teaching children, he sees that as a valuable thing. But it has more of a proximity to masculinity, and it has more of a proximity to what she does, because men can also be teachers. A man would never spend a week cleaning and redecorating a home to make people feel comfortable.
Unless Rochester knew that Jane was coming over, and he would spend all of his money just to pick out the perfect pillow that Jane would love to rest her little head upon.
Rochester has some toxic masculinity, don't get me wrong. But when it comes, he's willing to set all that aside. He wore a pearl necklace for Jane.
I was going to say, this is a man who will gladly get into drag at a party. I think he's definitely going to be like, oh my God, my girlfriend's coming over, so we're going to redecorate my entire house. We've got 5 hours and the budget is unlimited. Let's go.
He's no, but not only does he do drag, but later he's wearing the pearl necklace that she left in her room.
Yeah, because he's a cute boy.
And you telling me that if Jane cleaned and changed the drapes on a room, and he could still be blind, and he would still be like, oh my God, it's beautiful, babe. It's so good.
He's like, I'm feeling the drapes, not a speck of dust. Amazing. Oh boy, well, internet's a weird thing. Mine crashed a whole bunch of times, so it's the next day. We're back back. So we had talked a lot previously about how Sinjin sucks, obviously.
Yeah.
Don't need to beat a dead horse. But one horse that I would rather pet and give sugar cubes to is, again, kind of carrying over from what we talked about last section about how there's so much, I don't know, camaraderie, sisterly affection and closeness here. So it really stood out to me, the scene where Jane, after having to deal with Sinjin, goes and speaks with Diana, and just how good that dialogue was written between the two of them and how like supportive she was. I think Bronte's very good at writing girl talk. I think you can see that she grew up with sisters, and that came through very well. But I liked all of those interactions.
Yeah, I think that's one of the other things that doesn't come through in some of the adaptations. It's something that we talk about a lot in these book episodes. And I think it's something that actually Charlene mentioned on the Care So Much episode that she did. Quick plug, other podcast. But the idea that the adaptions that do it right are focusing on Jane. And I think that the more that I think about that idea when we watch these adaptions and we talk about these adaptions, the more that I'm like, yeah, the ones that miss do things like pay attention, like just jump right to the love story, which we're here for the love story. We stay for the love story. We love the love story. Yes. But if you're focusing on Jane, it's easier to understand that, of course, Sinjin is an important character in these chapters. But almost more important are those small moments with these other women. And without really centering Jane in the story, it's easier to miss because then it becomes about this comparison between these two men, which is part of it. But it's also about her relationship with people in general.
Yeah, totally. And now that I'm thinking about it, because we did talk a lot the last book chunk episode about how this time away from Rochester and away from the love story is sort of Jane's time to sort of find her independence, find out who she is outside of the relationship, and then have the strength to go back to the relationship. And I'm now realizing, I think it's interesting that that scene with her chatting with Diana about how wrong it was for Sinjin to try and con her into going into India because she will surely die. But
which, please, if I'm doing this, you need to have friends in your life that if you're doing something that seems like a good idea, but you might die, you gotta have people that'll pull you out of there.
Yes, seriously. I will do that for you, Lillian, if I feel it is necessary.
I will as well, if Sam doesn't own in advance.
But this is kind of one of the last scenes where it is, I think, just a moment of Jane and just another person before we get back to kind of the romance, because then we get into a little more like stupid drama with Sinjin, then she hears the voice, and then it's all back to find out the rest of the story that we've been waiting to hear. And so I like, it's almost kind of like sending her back into the romance with one last little bit of like sisterly affection and kind of like this moment between the two of them, which I appreciate.
Yeah. And I think something that we talked about a little bit, but I think as you're bringing this up really recenters it in my brain, is this idea that how we see Jane's strength in these chapters and in these pages, because I think Bronte does such a beautiful job of writing complex, real characters. One of the things that I'm often disappointed by in the adaptions is the caricature of a strong person that Jane becomes by just like putting her hand, like we all know my like least favorite Jane is the 34, where she's like physically, literally strong and like putting her hands on her hips and stuff. Like, oh my God, I hate it so much. Because it implies that the only way to be strong is this way of being strong. So like,
exactly,
if you write a description of Jane and one of the bullets you put is strong person, and then the only way for her to be strong is by doing these things, then
smashing vases.
Yeah, smashing vases, putting her hands on her hip, yelling at people. Like, then reading these chapters, Jane's behavior seems very weak. And I think that's so wrong. Exactly. And I think it's so incredibly strong, her saying no to Sinjin, her reflecting on herself. And I think there's something really beautiful of her having a moment of questioning and changing her mind, like seeming to change her mind and move forward with what Sinjin it wants. Yeah. And if you're creating a two-dimensional character that is supposed to be strong, they would never do that.
Yes.
But because Jane is human, she has this moment where she's like, your arguments make sense. And I feel really passionately about God and doing the right thing. And what you're saying resonates with me. So maybe I am doing the wrong thing and I should go with you and do what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think that has its own kind of strength. And it's good that she didn't do that. But I think it's so beautiful and interesting. But I'm curious about your thoughts.
I think the strength that I see there, because I completely agree with you, I think it comes through more so, yes, it's definitely Jane's strength. I think there's a lot of strength in Bronte's writing and her own kind of like self-reflection that maybe was put into writing those scenes, because I think the strength lies in the vulnerability to see how, you know, it's like, well, you don't simply just be like, this is my theory and I'm going to stick to it always. You know, you doubt yourself, you question other things, you know, maybe you change your mind and you have the strength to say, well, maybe I was wrong and there's another way to do this and this could work. And yes, so I think it's about that vulnerability, that inflection, and the fact that we get to see that in our protagonist it's another way that we can relate to Jane, right?
Yeah.
So that we can like attach ourselves to her story, to be like, I've been in a situation in my life where I thought I knew what I wanted, but then I kind of second guessed myself. So I've been in her shoes. And I think that's a great way to, again, be like, oh, I'm Jane. Jane is me. Or I love Janes in my life and things like that.
Yeah. And I think that as you're saying that, I think you really articulated something that my brain has been dancing around of like, what is it about this? And that strength and vulnerability, I think, is a strength that is so often undervalued in general. And I think it's what we're trying to say Rochester has that St. John doesn't. St. John is an invulnerable character. That doesn't, like, he's obviously like goes through difficult things, but not with no vulnerability, because he has this certainty and he's sure that he essentially is God. Where Rochester is an incredibly vulnerable character. Yeah. In moments that it's easy to miss, he's wildly vulnerable. And I think similar to so many of these other themes that we've talked about in this book, I think vulnerability in and of itself could be something that we parse, because we talked about what do we love about the proposal scene. We love a vulnerable Rochester. We love those moments. What do we love about that make or break stay scene if Rochester's vulnerable? And then to point out the fact that there's this vulnerability in Jane in this moment, in a place where that vulnerability could be considered dangerous.
I was just going to talk about that, is that scene is so bizarre and interesting to me, where I've said this a couple of times earlier in this episode, where I think it's because she listens to St. John like passionately read the scripture, which she personally connects to, and it puts her into this vulnerable state, and it is dangerous. And I think the scene it creates this tension, because St. John is the kind of manipulative person who sees Jane's vulnerability, but he's taking advantage of it. It was also a like my skin is crawling moment when, as she's going through this very personal, vulnerable experience, he inserts himself, physically touches her, puts his hand on top of her head, which was so gross to me. I hated that. But he's like trying to be like, oh yes, I am part of this spiritual awakening too. I created it. This is all my doing. And I'm just sitting there and I'm like, get away. She's having a moment. Stop bothering her. Yeah. And thank God, yes, then the voice comes. But it does, that vulnerability, it makes, vulnerable. Yeah. She is in danger of being manipulated by St. John and possibly like making a bad choice. And so I'm so glad that fate intervenes there.
Well, and I think it's the most truly like supernatural moment. I think it may be the only actually supernatural moment, if we ignore her childhood feelings of a ghost, is that moment of Rochester hearing his voice. And I think if we're saying that Jane in this moment is being incredibly vulnerable because of her connection to God and her faith, and then in that moment, Bronte decides to bring in a supernatural power that could in some ways be the voice of God, being like, he's wrong. Rochester's right. Yeah. Oh, chills, Piper.
Dude, that could obviously be an episode in itself of just simply kind of discussing that. But I feel like I can't do a lot of like, oh, this is what this means, or this is what it means, because it's just so open for interpretation. And I think I kind of like it that way. There are some things where I'm like, we don't need to break down the exact meaning of like these two people hearing each other's voices from across a nation and then running to one another. But I wish I could read an interview with Bronte about her thoughts on that. Because I would love to hear what she would say about being like, this is why I wrote this.
I think there are resources about what, I don't know specifically that, but again, per always, listeners, hi listeners, any chance that you guys want to, if you know of like resources like Bronte's journals or like anything like that you can send us places to find those. We'll probably do our own little googs, but if you send it to us, we're much more likely to talk about it sooner.
But yeah, I mean, regardless of how it happens or why, she hears him. She runs away from St. John, thank God.
Yeah.
And she essentially like dismisses him, and she's like, all right, go away. I need to be alone. And she like goes up to her room and like prays and stuff. And then it's like pretty much decided in her mind that she's going back to Thornfield.
Yeah.
And I think if I'm remembering right, in the morning, he like slides like a very passive aggressive little note under her door where he's like, hey, we were like having a moment. And then you like started screaming about something and pushed me away, and it wasn't cool. I'm not done telling you about how I'm right and you're wrong and you're gonna be mine to mate with, so we'll pick this up later. I know, it's just like, oh God, get out of there, sweet bean.
Yeah, it's the moment of like, hey, I was like super close to manipulating you into doing what I wanted, and you like ran out crying. If you could not do that next time, it was very inconvenient for me and my God complex.
My gosh, dude, I hate him so much.
I literally wrote, sorry, I'm flipping through my book, like looking for some of my notes, and I wrote, come on, dude, like 4 times.
Yeah, no, my goodness. So yeah, Jane packs up and she heads back to the area where Thornfield is, and she stops at an inn and asks some questions. Well, no, first she goes to the house.
She goes to the house and sees it's all burned.
It's all burned. She walks among the rubble, which here, if you were a first time like consumer of this story, maybe you would recall that she's had dreams of like the house being burned down. So there's other supernatural things here. She's had visions and premonitions of these sort of things.
Yeah.
And yeah, then she goes to that inn or that tavern or whatever it is to talk to the guy and get some answers. Any thoughts about that section, or do we just want to jump right?
The hot second, the only thing that I want to mention is like, we've seen this, I think in the 73 for sure. The moment where the innkeeper's like, I used to, or whoever she's talking to at the end is like, I used to work for the late Mr. Rochester. She goes, the late Mr. Rochester.
Yeah.
he's like, whoa. Edward's dad, chill the fuck out. And that's when she's like, oh, I can handle it now. And her commentary on how annoyed she is by the way this man is telling the story. And I'm just like, Charlotte, you're telling the story.
Again, though, it's that realness, right? Where like you're just like chatting with some old timer and he's like, oh, well, this one time when my knee was acting up, and you're like, shut up. Is my love alive or is he not? I need these answers. Very frustrating. Oh, one thing I had a note on about when he's telling the tale to fill Jane in on is he describes, first of all, that after the governess ran away, aka Jane, that Mr. Rochester was like inconsolable and like mad and wild and all this stuff. And I'm just like, ooh, I love that trope. Like he's lost his love and now he's like this dangerous man with his grief. So I loved that. It was great. But even though he is mad with like sadness and rage, he still is this sweet, providing little man because he sets Miss Fairfax up for life with enough money to go.
Know.
He's like, I am sad and depressed and moody and angry. Oh, but here's your retirement fund, and I got you this little house, and I love you. Okay, here's a bowl of soup. Back to brooding because my love ran away. And it's just like, Rochester.
He just like, he's such a caretaker, because we talked about that. How that stands out in our first couple of book chapters, that he's taking care of these two incredibly vulnerable people with Adele and Miss Fairfax. And then he still takes care of them. One of the things that I want to talk about within the description of the fire as well
Yes.
is, okay, so this, honest to God, I know this is like a dumb thing to have like been waiting for in the book, but the way that the fire happens in all these adaptions is always so different. Like, it's one of the few things that is dramatically different every time. And in more than one of them, it says he was hit by a burning beam. And then he's actually fine. So they're like, a burning beam fell on him, but he's fine. And I'm like, it must be what happens in the book is that he gets hit by a burning beam, but then they just don't do as much damage to him as they do in the book. He's saved by a beam, guys.
Yeah.
The beam falls and blocks the rest of the rubble from falling on him so he doesn't die.
Also, so two things that were, I know in the past there was some adaptation that we watched where maybe it's the 70s one where the guy is telling the story and he mentions, he's like, oh yeah, and then her brains were all over the pavement.
Ew.
And I remember you being like, yuck, gross, why are you telling us this? And so I love that's in the book. But the old man also includes the fact that apparently Rochester's eye just popped right out of his head. I was like, dude, how do you know these details?
Because that's the way you tell this. Like, they didn't have TV. They needed people to tell a disgusting amount of detail about exactly what happened to these people who got deeply injured.
So now I love whenever I think of an adaptation where they don't, like Timothy Dalton, they gave him this epic big scar over one eye because the eyeball literally popped out of the socket. Everyone else is just like, no, his eyes look totally fine. He just stares off into the middle distance.
Honestly, it's kind of yucky. But he always gets a beard. Did they describe him? They described him as like scraggly. But she doesn't specifically say, does she specifically say he has a beard?
She doesn't say anything about facial hair.
She
just mentions his
long hair.
Yeah, his black mane. Yeah.
So I don't think you're wrong to interpret that he has a beard, but every time, guys, he always had his depression beard.
I think that's their best way to be like, ooh, he's letting himself go. He's
really letting it go. And you can tell because this incredibly hot actor has a beard now.
So Jane hires the coach to take her to this cottage. There's a lot of description about how tucked away into the woods it is. It goes on for a while. Then she peeps outside the house and sees her beloved Rochester for the first time in like a year plus. Yeah. And he's out there blind, feeling the rain. A guy tries to bring him inside and he's all like, "Murr, murr, murr, murr."
Hold on. I have something important on that. Which is, did you notice specifically what time of day it was, Piper?
It was twilight.
It was twilight, our little crepuscular babies.
They're just doing what they do, always meeting at dawn and dusk.
Ooh. Twilight, the hour of love, ladies and gentlemen.
Hell yeah, man. Then she goes in, she sees the servants, and they're all like, whoa, what up? It's you. And she's like, I'm going to go bring in this tray to Rochester. And she goes in there, and I love the interaction with Pilot. As you mentioned, Ooh. Pilot comes first. He knows her and all that jazz. And yeah, any particular thoughts or comments on their reunion?
Yeah. I mean, it's so cute. It's very incredibly cute. It's like I think one of the things that I loved the most in this is how much he calls her a fairy in this.
Yeah.
I literally out loud said, "Aw," when he called her a fairy again. And here's the thing with Rochester. If I were going to pick one reason that Rochester is the perfect man, which he's not, but if I was going to pretend he was, his dream, like what he's saying by believing that she's a hallucination, is that in his best dreams, in his wildest fantasies, he doesn't get his sight back. He doesn't regrow his hand. He doesn't regain his home or his fortune. Jane comes back. Yeah. That's his biggest dream in the world.
Yeah.
And
no, it's so
he
dang
can't
cute.
believe it because he loves her so much.
And I love all of the descriptions of like him, touching from her hand to her arm, to her shoulder, to her neck, to her face, around her waist, kind of pulling her to him. And I love how even later on when they're going on their little walk and he's trying to, he's asked her about St. John and he's getting jealous and he's like, you should leave me, Jane. Don't sit on my lap anymore. Go marry that guy. But he's still like holding her even tighter because he's like, I don't actually want to let you go. And it's just like really sweet.
I wrote literally, now this is a man next to next to the lines where he says, he eagerly snatched me closer. No, Jane, no, you must not go. My very soul demands it of you.
Yes, once again we're back to like why he's so great is he's like, no, it's like my spirit addresses your spirit.
Yeah.
Like we are one and the same and you've come back to me, and it's so nice.
And it's always this clear, like, I think you might be a hallucination. And obviously, if you're not, you can do whatever you want. And you should probably be happy. And I can't imagine you would be happy with me. But I just will not send you away because I love you so much that the idea of being the reason that you aren't here is like impossible for me.
Yes. There's have been in a few of our palette cleansers, some of my favorite romantic moments are usually at the end. And typically I see this portrayed in through the male actor, where he knows at this point that this woman is the one for him. And whatever she says, it doesn't matter. His eyes are just glazed over with this like look of complete like adoration and love. And I kind of got elements of that as soon as Jane walks back into that room, where he is like, yes, he's excited, but then of course he's like, am I hideous, Jane, and all this other stuff. But no matter what he says, she's just like, I found you. You're alive. That's all I care about. I thought you were dead. You're not. You're alive. You're here. And no matter what, I'm going to stay by your side. Whether it is, hopefully it will be for kisses and smooches as your wife. But even if I'm your nurse or your companion or your neighbor, I've found you and I'm not going away. And so I love that kind of soft joy and kindness and tenderness that I think I personally read in a lot of her dialogue in that scene of kind of like teasing him a little, kind of calming his fears. Yeah. Those were all fun.
It was so cute that she was like, he seems pretty upset. I think I should probably make fun of him.
I know. And you're like, come on, Jane. You know how sensitive he is.
But like at the same time, it is the thing that pulls him out of his self-pity, is her just being like, I don't know, there was other men. And I just
he's like,
what? With them. But another wildly romantic line is he starts with the beginning of the passage, he starts with, oh, you are indeed there, my skylark. All the melody on earth is contained in my Jane's tongue to my ear. All the sunshine I can feel is in her presence.
Yeah. Oh, it's actually really similar to how Jane earlier in the novel was describing like just being near him, like he is the source of her happiness. And now to hear him kind of say it back, it's very pretty.
Yeah, it's so wonderful. Okay, any more thoughts? And then I have final thoughts on them being together and happy forever.
Amazing. Yes. So she stays the night, not in his room. He wishes. And then he's like so excited that she's there in the morning for breakfast, and they go on their little walk, and he has proposal part 2, which I love. There's a bit of like preamble of him kind of being like, oh, well, you're not going to be with me, but, cause I don't want a companion. I want a wife. And she's like, ask me a question then. And he's like, will you marry me? She's like, yep. And he's like, but wait a second, there's all these things. And she's like, I already said yes, dude. You can't back out now. Like, no take backs. But there's, I think one of my favorite parts in this whole section is after the proposal, she's already said yes, but now he's like coming up with all these things about why it probably couldn't work. And he says, because you delight in sacrifice. And her response I thought was so good, of saying, sacrifice? What do I sacrifice? Famine for food? Expectation for content? To be privileged to put my arms around what I value, to press my lips to what I love, to repose on what I trust. Is that to make a sacrifice? If so, then certainly I delight in sacrifice.
Oh, it's gonna make me cry.
Good. Well done, Bronte.
It's so cute. I love them.
Oh, I love it. It also like really made me think of, you know how much I love this, but in the 94 Little Women, that proposal scene under the umbrella, where it's very similar. Like they say they'll get married and all this jazz, but then he's like, but I have nothing to give you. My hands are empty. And she holds his hand and she's like, it's not empty now. Like there's like, she's like, no, you are the only thing I need. Yeah. It's so nice.
Yeah.
Oh, love it.
Ooh, I love them. I love that they just like go get married and come back and they're like, we did it.
Yep, right. They're like, no one's going to interrupt this wedding. No, so good. There's a moment in that passage too where like Rochester does a little bit of self reflection. It's kind of like an apology where he's like, I'm so glad looking back now that like I have you authentically and that you didn't actually do bigamy with me, because that would have not been anything close to how awesome this is, because it's legitimate. Who cares if I'm blind and only have one hand?
Yeah.
Like I have you and you are mine and we can be good together. There's also, I think I touched on this a bit earlier, but Rochester kind of like touches his own or reconnects with his own spirituality a bit here, I think, because he says that, I think when he's describing to her, when he called out to her, that it was kind of his own version of prayer, which is something it sounds like he's kind of forsaken.
Which, really quickly, Rochester for sure prays to Jane, right?
Yeah, he's got a little altar. Exactly. No doubt.
I think it's wonderful and beautiful. And like you said earlier, we're gonna have to do an episode on theology of this. There's some other themes that we're going to talk about, but that's for sure one. And I completely agree with you. I think it's really beautiful I want to parse through that. It's an episode.
Yes, definitely.
But I think another piece that in that very happily ever after chapter that ends with the most famous of lines of "Dear reader, I married him" is, she says, we've been married for 10 years now. I know no weariness of my Edward's society. He knows none of mine, any more than we each do of the pursuit of heartbeats that in our separate bosoms. Consequently, we are ever together.
It's really sweet.
And she had earlier said that eventually he would tire of her. Like, that was her prediction, is that even though they love each other, there's no way they're going to love each other this much and want to spend all of their time together all the time, because that just doesn't happen. And it does.
Well, it's so cute, right? When she talks about, she's like, oh, I want to go get Adele. We'll just get her after the honeymoon. And Rochester's like, well, she'll have to wait till we're dead then, because this honeymoon is going to last until we're in our graves. She's like, okay, nice. All right.
And then I think it's so cute that she does go get Adele, and that Adele is like so excited. She says the line that I say all the time on this podcast, which is, did you think we forgot about Adele? No, I didn't. I asked about that for like the first 4 adaptions we watched. I was like, what the fuck happened with Adele?
Yes, go get her.
So she gets her, and Adele's so happy to see her, and she brings her back, and she's like, listen, I was gonna teach her, but as it turns out, taking care of my disabled husband and being a wife, fucking all day.
I was just gonna say, that's how
much of my time.
That's how I read that line too. She's like, but my husband demanded so much of me. And I was like, wink, 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 wink. She's like, oh, I can't really take care of this girl when I'm just constantly banging my one-eyed, one-hand husband.
Oh my God.
Priorities.
Here's something that I'm really curious about, because she gives us the important updates first. Like, she tells us about Adele. She tells us about Rochester. She tells us about him getting his sight back. She tells us about Mary and Diana. She ends the fucking book talking about St. John.
I know. And that's something that is like, I know, a big topic of debate in when people like review and talk about this book, like why he gets the last word and everything. And I think that was one of the things that when I said earlier, I'm like, this section feels so faith and like religion based. And the fact that we end on him and his kind of like talking about his faith thing. Like, I have to look at the line again to see exactly what it was.
I've got it in front of me if you want.
Which also, so 10 years go by and St. John is totally like he's dying, right? Like, that's what they're talking about at the end, that he's him
dying.
He's in India. He's got food poisoning because he's got a sensitive little English tummy. And now he's dying at like age 45 or something.
Not even, because he was 28.
Okay. So he's 38 and he's dying in India. Suck it. No fear of death will darken St. John's last hour. Yep, he's on his deathbed. Farewell. His mind will be unclouded. His heart will be undaunted. His hope will be sure. His faith steadfast. His own words are a pledge of this. My master, he says, has forewarned me. Daily he announces more distinctly, surely I come quickly, and hourly I more eagerly respond. Amen. Even so come, Lord Jesus. Yeah, I don't know. It's just kind of like, last word is that he writes her letters, still never acknowledging her husband or the fact that she's married, obviously still spiteful in his last minutes. And I think it seems kind of like on his deathbed, he's writing like her a letter to say, I was right, by the way. God is like opening his doors for me like I predicted. Okay, bye. Just like, what the hell?
Well, and we've had 3 if we consider this a deathbed scene, we've had 3 deathbed scenes in this book. One is Helen, who dies very peacefully, telling Jane about the fact that she's going to get a reward and that it's actually not sad that she's dying. What a bummer. 2 is Aunt Reed, who dies spiteful and bitter, talking about how much she truly hates Jane and all the terrible things that she did, but how terrified she is to die because she knows that her bad behavior means she won't get into heaven. And then the very last one, it's this absolute piece of trash, dying after living she describes an incredibly sad life. Sure that he's going to get his reward as well. But I don't think we are supposed to believe that St. John is doing the right thing.
No.
I think it's meant to be open to interpretation. But I also think the fact that it ends here speaks to the fact that this is a book that what is often lost is it's a criticism of religion and theology. And it is a conversation around what does it mean to be a good person? And she's telling that with a love story. And she's telling that by centering this woman's life. Yeah. And I think she's so intentional with everything. There's no way it's an accident that she ends with St. John.
Of course. You know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, if I were to come up with sort of like a hypothesis about maybe what this is supposed to be saying so St. John is someone who I think is supposed to like represent kind of like the perfect rule follower. The society that we live in is correct. And Rochester obviously is this person who, because he was betrayed by the people who misuse like the rules of society, he said famously, he's like, fuck this rule system. I'm going to go do whatever I want and try to be happy. Because in the end, Jane and Rochester end up together. And then St. John dies by like quoting how like, he's like, oh, I love the system. Peace out. Like, I think it's kind of her way of being like, yeah, like if it was St. John's way, I would not be with Rochester and I would also be like dead in India. And like, so I think, yeah, you're right. It's kind of this way of saying that you don't have to, if you follow the rules of society, you will die like St. John does, where she and Rochester, who followed their hearts, end up happy and together.
And I think I don't think it's an answer. I think it's a question that she's asking. Yeah. I think she's saying, do you live a sad yet objectively, like rule following objectively, righteous life? Or do you follow your heart and and find love and happiness and still treat people well and but like really live here on earth? And spoilers for our future theology episode, I'm with Jane. I actually think if the person in this book whose theology most matches with mine is honestly probably Rochester.
Nice.
I'm not locking anyone in the attic, but the idea that other people don't get to decide what the right thing is.
Yeah. Lillian, we did it. We read Jane Eyre.
Listen, I'm not going to lie. I liked this book.
Yeah, I liked it a whole lot. I'm so glad I have really enjoyed getting to discuss these chapters in depth with you. I love having the background knowledge of the adaptations that we've watched so far to be able to reflect on those and like getting to both explore my interpretation of this as well as like hearing, your takes and getting to talk about them on air. And it's really like satisfied something in me that I haven't had in a while since graduating college, where I was in like, courses where we would like do analysis of film or books or things. And so getting to do this again has been really nice.
Yeah, it's been so wonderful to talk to you as well. I think they've been some of my favorite episodes to do. And like you said, I love coming in with the context of these adaptions because I think in some ways, And I think it's what's interesting about our podcast in general and why it's fun to do our podcast in general. We talk a lot about how much of this book is open for interpretation. And in some ways, all of these different adaptions are all these different people showing us their interpretations of the story and what is at the heart of the story and how they see that and how they play with these themes. So that's been just like a hoot and a half.
And I think that kind of touches on one of our big questions of like, why has this been adapted so many times? Because you could take so many things out of it. You could have, as we've seen now, like 50 plus adaptions where like a good chunk of them are kind of focused on different elements of this story. Like, are you telling a romance? Are you telling a gothic cautionary tale? Are you telling a political discussion of faith and society? Are you just spewing out a copy of what you saw people do a few years ago because you know there's a fan base and they're going to keep watching it? Like, what are you making here? Yeah.
And I think that we're not done doing that. For anybody listening to this being like, you sound like you're like finishing up. We're going to keep doing that. We're going to keep doing what Eyre Buds has always been. We're also going to keep doing episodes that sound and feel like these book episodes if you've really loved these, by having conversations that are more in depth on some of these themes. I know the first one we have coming up is going to be specifically on Bertha. That's going to be in a bit here. I don't like to give out dates and times on things because, as you guys know, it changes.
It sure do. Life happens.
Sometimes your internet goes out.
Yeah. And we record the next day.
So we've got those coming up. We have rewatches coming up. The first one we're going to do, we've talked about a lot in these books episodes. We're going back to our roots, to the first one we watched and the one that got Piper into this mess in the first place, the 83.
Oh, Lillian, I am so excited for that. Literally, I know I've said this before, but reading this book and now seeing how close of an adaptation that is, I'm just like, I just want to see Timmy D read these lines and love him even more for them.
So we have that coming up, and keep an eye, if that's something you are also particularly excited for, keep an eye on our social, because we've talked about trying to watch these together and see different ways that we can do cool stuff there. So if you want to make sure that you're a part of that, make sure to follow us on all of our social. Speaking of our social, Piper, we've launched a new channel. We now, guys, not only are we on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, we're also on YouTube now, because I make too many videos for this show.
Lillian is honing her amazing video editing skills, and we are her guinea pig. So you get to come along and see what kind of fun clips she pulls together for some of these audio things we've given you.
If you were listening to our last episode and you were like, what a fun little joke about Shrek, I have some exciting news for you. Go check out our YouTube. I made a video of the fun little joke about Shrek. We also, if you think to yourself, the Shrek jokes are not why I come to Eyre Buds, which is weird. We've got some other really cool stuff coming up. I'm going to do not a lot of these because they're a lot of work to make, but full video episode of, I'm starting with in a few weeks. You should see some of those coming up. But there are going to be videos that are a little bit longer than some of the ones we've put on Instagram and things. So if that's something you enjoy from Eyre Buds, head over there, subscribe. It's something we'll do more of if people are interested in it. So if this sounds exciting to you, please go actually subscribe to that, because if nobody wants it, I probably won't keep doing it.
Well, I think it's definitely worth a check out. Just another fun thing to watch and consume. If you have enjoyed reading along with us and you want to share some of your final thoughts and takeaways, because of course we want to know what you think, please reach out to us. You could either message us on all of the social, we are at Eyre Buds, or send us a nice lengthy essay style email to airbuds@gmail.com. What do you think the moral of this story is? Why do you think she ends with St. John? How do you feel about this kind of discussion of faith at the end of the book? Do you even see it that way? Write us. We'd love to know what your thoughts are.
And we have a couple of, we also have some other episodes coming up in addition to the many other things that I alluded to. Next week, we are going to be watching our first play. We've done 2 musicals, but this is the first time that people are going to be on stage and as far as I'm aware, not a singing, no singing, which will be the National Theatre production, which is the UK National Theatre. Have fewer names for your country, because I don't know if it's like the English National Theatre or the British National Theatre or the United Kingdom National Theatre. And I understand that they all mean slightly different things, but it's confusing and unhelpful.
You're really just bothering Lillian right now. So just like pick a lane, please.
For me specifically.
Yes, there's one American podcaster who's upset, and so you need to change everything.
Thank you.
Please, thank you. And if you don't, your entire country can meet her in the abandoned Kmart parking lot. I will have an inflatable Uncle Sam like behind you to be like, yeah, get him, Lily.
That's spectacular. So you've got that to look forward to. If this happens and I fight the entirety of a country, we'll probably live stream that.
It'll probably be global news, and then we'll really pop off.
But one more ask that I have for our wonderful, beautiful listeners is we are doing a mini episode for Thanksgiving that we have alluded to in the past as well. And we're very lovingly referring to it as In Defense of Michael Jaston. And I am going to be trying to convince Piper that Michael Jaston is not, in fact, one of the worst Rochesters. He's one of the best. And I am working on some fun surprises for Piper for that. And I'm asking for our listeners' help. So this will probably be posted on social as well, but you can always email us or DM us on Instagram or any of the other channels. Send me why you like Michael Jaston. What particular scenes maybe, and you can just describe them. I have access to all the videos, ding. And that is also alluding to another reason to follow us on YouTube. So
yeah, cool.
There we go.
Don't want to miss out on that. Well, you guys, it's now been 2 days of recording for Lillian and I, so I think we should say goodbye. Thank you for reading along with us. Thank you for listening along with us. I'm still going to end it this way every single time. Happy Jane Eyre reading and watching, because as we know, you can always get more out of this during the next read. So we'll see you later, guys.
Bye.
Bye.